Welcome to the Inner West Library Speaker Series. My name is Kathy Kalaizis and I'm a Senior Library Programming and Events Officer for Inner West Council. Before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Aurora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today we'll be talking to Tanya Bretherton about her latest true crime book, The Killing Streets. Tanya Bretherton has a PhD in sociology with special interest in narrative life, history and social history. She has published in the academic and public sphere for 20 years and worked as a senior research fellow at the University of Sydney for 15 years. Dr. Bretherton's specialty is converting detailed research into thought-provoking works which are accessible to a general readership. Currently, she works as a freelance researcher and writer. Her first book, The Suitcase Baby, was shortlisted for the Ned Kelly Award, the Danger Prize, and the Waverley Library Nib Award. Her second book, The Suicide Bride, was shortlisted for the Danger Prize. The Killing Streets, uncovering Australia's first serial murder, is a story of a series of horrific murders that began in 1930s Sydney, and a killer who remained at large for over 2 decades. This compelling story of a city crippled by fear and a failing economy of a killer at large as panic abounds is also the story of what happens when victims aren't perfect and neither are suspects, and when a rush to judgment replaces the call of reason. Welcome, Tanya. Tanya, I believe the State Archives is your second home. Do you lose track of time when you're there? Many people say that if they must self-isolate, the best place to be is in a library. Would you consider self-isolating at the State Archives?
I do spend a lot of time at the State Archives, and they're not really like a library. So they're not like a library like the environment that we're in here, where you can go in and take a book off the shelf. So you do have to commit to spend a lot of time there because you retrieve books, you retrieve documents, and it takes time. But I would say I'd recommend to anyone to go to our State Archives. They are places of real joy and wonder in our state. Our history's there. And every book that I've ever written has emerged from a tangent. So I've gone out to the archive to look for one thing and I've discovered a tangent that's led to another book. So if you're a researcher and you're a writer, they're wonderful places.
Tanya, can you talk briefly about your new book, The Killing Streets? There are so many true crime murders. What is it that makes you know, right, this is the one that you want to talk about?
It's different for every book, I think. I think I'm a writer that operates, as much as they're very research-based endeavours, I write a lot from the heart. So I will wait until I have a moment in the research process where I gasp, so I have a gasp moment, or it's something that I discover that makes me cry. That will often be the stimulus for a book. With The Killing Streets, I actually came across the story of Eric Craig years ago. So it was probably around the time that I was doing the work for The Suitcase Baby, and I'd never really wanted to write a book on a serial killer. It wasn't an area of true crime that was of particular interest to me, but then we had some very public murders of women. Jill Marr was killed. I don't know if people remember that murder, very publicly on a street in Melbourne. And some years later we had the death of Eurydice Dixon, which also happened in a very public place. And I'd been sitting on that work, that research that I'd done a little bit on Eric Craig's life and on those murders that had occurred in the around the time of his capture and conviction. And when those 2 murders happened more recently, I thought, I think it's time. I think there's a space for a history book to be written around these very public sort of sexual lust murders.
Researching The Killing Streets must have been like doing a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. I'm certain you're very good at jigsaw puzzles as well. But how and where do you start? How do you put the puzzle together with true crime?
I have a very particular way that I write my books. So they're always written, it's a triangulation of a number of sources. So I do a lot of genealogical research for my books. I do a lot of secondary source research. So I do a lot of social history because my background's sociology, so it's history that's written by a sociologist. But I also do a lot of archive research as well. So there's always a fitting together of different pieces. So a jigsaw puzzle's probably a really good analogy. And each of the books, there's always, when I'm at the archive, I'm looking for something. It might be crime transcripts, it might be, I even use things like probate records sometimes because they're very rich inventories of people's lives. But you usually need to write a book, to sort of sustain an entire book, you really need a jackpot research. So you need something, you need a jackpot resource, I'd put it that way. So you'll need a transcript or an inquest document. You need something big to sustain the work.
Bessie O'Connor was portrayed by the press as a nice girl with a promising future, as an Olympic swimmer. If she was just plain Bessie, her murder would have gone unnoticed like the others. Why weren't all the murders during the time not treated equally? Can you explain?
Because the police worked out very quickly that the women who had been the victims of these murders were all engaged in sex work. And that brought with it some very moral judgments of whether or not the police should be investigating. And there was a general agreement among many of the police that were involved in investigating that really the women had brought it on themselves because they were doing work they shouldn't have been doing. Different time period and a different set of values and norms, really, I think is probably the only thing we can sort of say about that.
Tanya, when sentencing for the murder of Bessie O'Connor, Eric Rolland Craig had an alibi with his wife, Mary Caroline. Why was this dismissed with the detectives handling the case, especially knowing that in the time frame it wouldn't have been possible to commit such a murder?
Yeah, the police pretty much disregarded anything Mary Caroline had to say. She was a wife, they didn't take her alibi seriously. I think they pretty much decided that Eric Craig was their guy and they sort of worked backwards from that. So it was a very different approach to policing and they pretty much stitched him up for it. That's my, I guess, view of it.
At a time when people would steal an eye from a needle, why would people who were fortunate enough to own a vehicle leave the keys so freely in the ignition? They would lock their doors to protect themselves and all their belongings, but didn't do the same with their vehicles. Why is this?
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it, that there were private motor vehicles parked in the street with their keys in them. And I think, we don't know, but I think the reason why people weren't just driving away with the vehicles is because not everyone could drive. So there was still, it was a point in history where more and more people were buying cars, but we didn't have the number of drivers that we have now. And cars were a little bit more complicated to drive. So I think that is the reason.
Tanya, page 160, Prosecutor McKean very eloquently said, the unfortunate woman was a follower of the oldest profession in the world. Can you tell us what decade you found prostitution was at its highest? And why were prostitutes deemed as immoral and their deaths not taken seriously?
Yeah, that is actually a really hard question to answer because it's an underground industry. So it's not like we can have a census really of the aggregate number of sex workers that were operating within a particular era within Sydney's history. So that part of the question I think I probably can't answer. What I can answer is that we know that there was a growth in the number of women engaged in sex work around the time of the Depression, because women were looking for income sources and a lot of families were hard on their luck. And one of the parallels or one of the kind of the aspects of the growth in that work that I look at in the book is the close association with the growth of the motor vehicle. So motor vehicles were being used in Sydney in a very different way, and they were kind of being incorporated into the sex work business model, if that's a way to talk about it. So there was a growth and there was a shift, I think, in the way that people were engaging in that kind of work.
Tanya, can you talk a little bit about Betty von Tonder, the South African nursemaid who had a passion for crime fiction? Police thought that Betty was fixated by a seductive death wish.
Yeah, her story is really interesting because I think it's one where we get to look through the prism of how police viewed these women. So Betty was she was working for a local, quite wealthy family, but she was a single woman who hadn't married and had children of her own. And when she was found murdered in quite a public place, I think police made the assumption that she was lonely, a bit desperate, and that led her to indulge in kind of strange fantasies around crime. And I guess that the expectation was that she was looking for a more exciting life than the one that she was leading. So there was a lot of value judgments placed on women, particularly on women who didn't choose to have children or get married. They were seen as being a bit odd.
The detectives and police were somewhat scant with their investigations about the murders at the time. They all appeared to be copycat murders. Why was further investigation with all murders dismissed? I believe the term serial killer was a phrase not known to anyone at that time.
Yeah, that's in fact one of the reasons why I was interested in writing the book, because the term serial killer really didn't exist. It's something that's been incorporated much more into profiling and the way that we study patterns of crime in the latter part of the 20th century. It really wasn't a feature of the way they approached criminal investigation at all. And that was kind of what interested me about it, because the book looks at a period of about 20 years, and there's a lot of murders that were quite similar that occurred during that period. So Eric Craig's, the crimes that Eric Craig was charged and convicted of, there were lots of others as well that occurred over a long period of time. And I thought that fascinated me, because our modern understanding of those crimes would be there's a similarity, they must have all been done or committed by the same person. And I thought what's much more frightening to me is the idea that there could have been lots of people capable of committing very similar crimes of a really, really horrible, horrible nature, and they weren't connected at all. So that made me, I think, it fascinates me, because I always thought the serial killer, that idea, the archetype of a serial killer, is something that's terrifying and horrible to us. On doing the research for this book, I started to think about it a little bit differently, because I thought it's actually a construct that we use to draw comfort from, because we think it's a serial killer, they're really, really statistically rare, it's a pathology that doesn't happen that often. What's much more frightening to me is that there might be lots of people capable of doing exactly this kind of thing. We just don't think about it that way. We like to think it's just one person, and they're very, very rare.
Tanya, like you said before in your book, what is known for sure is that the deaths of these 10 women were not properly investigated. In your blurb from the killing streets. Victims are not perfect and neither are the suspects. In conclusion, can you sum up the judicial system of the time?
There's probably two ways you could sort of approach that. I think on one hand, I was shocked at how judgmental the police were and how corrupt they were. I mean, I was shocked by that. But it was also an era of policing where they didn't have the tools that we have now. So, yes, there were some very snap, quick, subjective judgments made about certain people that they were considering as, to be suspects, but they also didn't have access to the level of forensic and science examination that they could bring to bear on cases. So it was a very, very different era of policing. Fascinating from a historical point of view, but very, very different.
Tanya, any new books? What's next in the pipeline?
Yes, there are. I'm currently working on a book on the post-war period, so it'll be the early 50s, late 1940s, early 50s, Sydney again, and it's on thallium poisonings. So anyone who's had an interest, I think, in true crime and Sydney's history would be aware there was a spate of poisonings that happened in that period in Sydney's history. So yeah, and again, there's always a gender dimension to my books. So that will feature as well.
Tanya, thank you so much for a wonderful interview. We wish you all the best with the Killing Streets and for any future publication. It has been an absolute pleasure. Bye everyone, and thank you for listening, and look out for upcoming digital content through the Inner West Library, What's On and social media channels. Inner West Council Libraries have an extensive true crime and crime fiction collection. Be sure to check them out next time you visit.